On the evening of November 12, 1996, two giants were rushing through the Delhi sky, both absolutely trusting the voice of the air traffic controller emanating from the radio waves. They believed that person would be able to keep them safe. One was climbing in altitude, the other was gradually descending. Now there was only exactly 1,000 feet between them, but that distance would vanish in the blink of an eye. How could airplanes, both in contact with one air traffic controller, collide with each other in midair? Today I make a fatal mistake. And what really happened that day? This is the story of the Charkhi Dadri midair collision between two planes, the most catastrophic in aviation history. In the early afternoon at Chimkin International Airport, Kazakhstan, on the tarmac, one Soviet-built Ilyushin Il-76 was preparing for a long flight of 4 hours to New Delhi. On board were 27 passengers, along with 10 crew members. This airline at that time was on the verge of bankruptcy. 27 merchants from the neighboring country of Kazakhstan had chartered this entire flight to get to Delhi to buy fabrics and Indian textiles, then bring them back home to sell for profit. It was not a glamorous journey, but it was flights like these that helped this airline continue to exist. At 3:55 p.m. Indian time, the 4-engine transport plane accelerated down the runway and took off into the Kazakhstan sky. At the same time in Delhi, a Boeing 747 of Saudia had also just landed from Jeddah. In just a few more hours, it would take off again to carry full of Indian migrant workers back to the Gulf to continue working and sending money home to their families, although the two flights had completely different journeys. But in a way, they both carried the same story. That is the story of children leaving their homeland to make a living in a foreign land. None of the two crews knew that in just a few hours, their flight paths would intersect, and the Delhi sky would change forever from then on. The flight from Chimkin to Delhi was not too long. It was only about 3.5 hours of flight. The plane was flying at a stable altitude of 33,000 feet. Everything was going completely normal. 2 hours after takeoff, the plane began to approach Delhi airspace, one of the most complex skies in the region, where every command and every change in altitude carried life or death significance. At 6:23 p.m., the plane flew to a waypoint called Longa. The crew contacted the approach control in Delhi to request permission to begin descending. They were ordered to descend to about 20,000 feet. At that exact moment, the Saudia Boeing 747 was preparing to depart. This giant plane would fly to Jeddah with a scheduled stop in Dhahran. On board were 32 crew members, along with 289 passengers. The majority were Indian workers, heading to the Gulf to work to provide for their families back home. All passengers had boarded the plane. The doors were closed. Over the radio waves, air traffic control spoke up. Saudia 763 is cleared for pushback. In the cockpit was 44-year-old Captain Khalid Al-Shubaili, a Saudi Arabian national with nearly 10,000 flight hours. Sitting next to him was 39-year-old American First Officer Naji Khan. Behind them was 36-year-old flight engineer Ahmet Enriz. Like the Kazakhstan crew, they were all highly experienced people, very familiar with the Boeing 747, as well as the busy sky above Delhi. Before this flight, they had had over 70 hours of continuous rest. By all standards, both crews were in an alert, healthy state, and completely ready. To make it easy for everyone to understand, I will call them one plane as Saudi and the other plane as Kazakhstan. Okay. At 6:33 p.m., Saudia 763 was cleared for takeoff. The 4 engines roared powerfully. The giant Boeing rushed down runway 28, piercing through the hazy evening mist, then slowly climbed into the cloudy Delhi sky. While the Saudi plane was climbing in altitude, the Kazakhstan plane was also only about 100 kilometers away and was also gradually descending to approach the airport. The special thing is that both were being guided by the same single person. That was approach controller VK Dutta. VK Dutta, 43 years old, was an air traffic controller with a lot of experience at Delhi Airport. However, back in 1996 in India, there was still no certification system for air traffic controllers. Most of them learned the trade right during actual work, accumulating experience day by day on duty, and that evening was a very busy shift. In front of Dutta were 5 planes, all needing to be handled immediately. A Saudi Boeing 747 had just taken off from Delhi. A Kazakhstan plane was on its way. 2 other domestic flights were already in the air, and a U.S. Air Force plane was also landing in Delhi. However, the biggest difficulty for Dutta did not lie in the number of planes, but the real problem was the structure of Delhi's airspace at that time. Unlike most other major airports in the world, where takeoff and landing lanes are separated into different corridors, in Delhi, there was only one air corridor for both directions of flight. Most of the airspace around the city was under military control. India's defense policy at that time prioritized using airspace for military purposes, and for civilian flights, they would only be allowed to use a single route called Gulf for 152. While commercial air traffic was increasing rapidly, all planes were forced to crowd onto this same aerial highway. One end of the flight route was the Longa waypoint, where the Kazakhstan plane had just passed. The other end was exactly where the Saudi Boeing 747 had just entered the route. The Saudi crew contacted controller Dutta and reported that they were climbing through flight level 8,000 feet to 10,000 feet. Dutta confirmed he had captured the radar signal and cleared them to continue climbing to 10,000 feet. Meanwhile, the Kazakhstan plane was at about 23,000 feet and was continuing to descend. Dutta ordered the Kazakhstan plane to descend to flight level 15,000 feet and to report back when reaching that altitude. The Kazakhstan crew confirmed the order. That short answer would later become one of the most important details of the entire investigation. Less than a minute later, the Boeing of Saudia had reached 10,000 feet as specified and requested permission to continue climbing higher. Dutta cleared them to climb to 14,000 feet. By this time, all the elements of the disaster were in place, in the right position. The 2 planes were flying head-on toward each other on the same route. The Saudi Boeing 747 was at 10,000 feet and was cleared to climb to 14,000 feet, while the Kazakhstan plane was about 80 kilometers away at an altitude of 20,000 feet and had been ordered to descend to 15,000 feet. Dutta's plan was very simple, which was to let these 2 planes cross each other with a vertical separation of 1,000 feet. After that, each would continue its journey. It sounded safe, but in reality, it was far from it. One might think that, with 2 planes approaching each other like that, Dutta must have had a modern radar system displaying altitude, speed, and collision warnings, but he had none. The only device in front of him was an outdated primary radar screen, where each plane appeared as a very simple bright dot. This radar completely did not display altitude or the distance between planes. The only way for Dutta to know what altitude each plane was at was to ask directly the pilots via radio. If any pilot reported incorrectly or misunderstood the command, there would not exist any second layer of protection to prevent the disaster from happening. On the screen, Dutta only saw 2 bright dots of the Saudi Boeing and the Kazakhstan one, slowly approaching each other. As long as they maintained that 1,000-foot distance vertically, they would both just pass each other safely. But at that time, he still had not informed any crew that there was another plane very close to them. It was now 6:37 p.m. A minute had passed since the last contact. The Kazakhstan plane was continuing to descend to 15,000 feet, while the Saudi Boeing was still climbing to 14,000 feet. Only 3 more minutes until the collision would occur. In the control tower, Dutta was watching the radar screen. The Kazakhstan crew called in, reporting that they had descended to 17,000 feet and were continuing down to 15,000 feet. Dutta instructed them to maintain 15,000 feet. 30 seconds later, the Saudi crew also called. They reported that they had reached 14,000 feet and requested permission to continue climbing to 20,000 feet. Dutta immediately instructed them to maintain 14,000 feet and wait for further instructions. Based on this order, the Saudi plane would fly 1,000 feet lower than the Kazakhstan for both
plane
planes
just
to
enough
pass each other safely.
Quickly
Dutta
jotted down those instructions on a small piece of paper
that was
placed
almost
next to
the
him.
entire automation system that he had during his shift that day. The 2 dots on the screen continued to move toward each other, but he knew they were very close. did not know exactly what altitude
he called
they
the
were at.
Kazakhstan crew back.
To confirm their position, the pilot replied that they had reached 15,000 feet and were currently 74 kilometers on the 270-degree radial. However, the investigation later showed that at that exact moment, the Kazakhstan plane was actually still at an altitude of about 16,000 and had not yet descended to 15,000 feet as they reported. Of course, Dutta had no way of knowing the pilot's report and continued to manage. After that, for the first time since the beginning of the flight, he informed them that there was a 747 flying opposite them at the 12 o'clock position, about 16 kilometers away, and expected to pass them in about 8 kilometers more. He asked the crew to report back to him if they saw the other plane. Inside the cockpit of the Kazakhstan plane, the air suddenly went silent for a moment. Exchanges in Russian rang out in the back. The crew members began straining their eyes to search for the oncoming plane, trying to identify its position in the darkening evening sky. There was a long silence. Finally, the Kazakhstan crew spoke up to ask how much further they were from the other. Replied that the target was about 12 kilometers away. The Kazakhstan pilot replied briefly, 14,000 feet. That was the last communication that anyone heard. From the Kazakhstan flight, on the radar screen, the two dots continued to approach each other. Dutta called the Saudi Boeing. He reported traffic opposite at the 12 o'clock position, about 9 kilometers away, and they would cross each other in about 5 kilometers. He asked them to report if they saw it. The Saudi crew replied, looking for traffic. That was also the last words transmitted from the Boeing 747. Dutta had nothing else he could do now. Only 10 seconds before the disaster occurred. Amidst the atmosphere, exactly 6:40 p.m. Silent and tense as suddenly the scream of the radio operator in the cockpit of the Kazakhstan plane rang out. Maintain altitude. Finally, he had also clearly seen the altimeter. But instead of immediately returning the captain of the Kazakhstan plane hesitated and asked back, what altitude were we cleared to? He was no longer sure what altitude he was supposed to maintain. The flight engineer, who had been silent from the start, now hurriedly said, maintain it. But he did not specify what altitude to maintain. Only the radio operator understood the meaning. He shouted loudly, maintain 15,000 feet, but panic immediately engulfed the entire cockpit. The captain immediately realized the mistake. He disengaged the autopilot engine and ordered. The engines roared. Increasing thrust, the radio operator shouted again in a trembling voice, because at 14,000 feet, there it is. In that moment, he must have seen a flash of piercing through the clouds was rushing straight toward Boeing 747. The Kazakhstan plane slammed into the Saudi Boeing with a terrifying impact force. In just a split second later, the horizontal stabilizer sliced off the tail of the Kazakhstan plane like a giant blade. In a brief but horrific moment, the two giant planes locked together in a ball of fire, then broke apart and spiraled. Falling from an altitude of about 14,000 feet, debris rained down on the villages below. The entire sky was dyed a bright orange by fire. In the Delhi approach control room, the air traffic controller, when he saw, was stunned. The two dots on the radar separated, then both disappeared completely. A few seconds later, the radio emitted the final gentle sounds. In Arabic, may God bear witness that there is no God but Allah, Dutta repeatedly called back. Time after time, but no one answered. After the accident, investigators quickly arrived at the scene. They began piecing together to reconstruct what had happened. The black boxes of both planes were found. However, because India at that time did not yet have black box decoding technology, the device from the Kazakhstan plane was sent to, while the black box of the Saudi plane was transferred to London for analysis. The investigators, for the results, continued to examine the scene. The debris stretched over 7 kilometers across and amidst a sea of debris. They discovered the first clue. The tail of the Kazakhstan plane lay at the very beginning of the debris trail. That could only mean one thing: that the tail had been torn off at the very moment of the first impact. This was an extremely important detail, because the Kazakhstan plane was designed with a high-mounted tail, according to the instructions of air traffic control, fly above the Saudi Boeing. If the tail was the first then that could only happen when the Kazakhstan plane was flying lower. This immediately raised a series of questions. Was it the Kazakhstan crew that had descended too low? Or was it the Saudi Boeing that had climbed too high? Or was it the air traffic controller who gave the wrong instruction before the black box data from Moscow and London was sent back? No one could confirm anything. But the investigators already had in their hands extremely important, which was the entire recording between the radio and the Delhi control tower. They reviewed the entire recording but did not find any errors in the way air traffic controller did with an outdated radar system that only displayed bright dots. He had absolutely no ability to verify the actual altitude of the planes. Every procedure as required. The investigators even trusted that conclusion to the point that Dutta was allowed to return to duty after only 3 days. Just 3 days after the accident, when the responsibility of the air traffic controller was ruled out, there were only two possibilities. Either there had been an error in the cockpit of the Kazakhstan plane. Saudi Boeing on the Kazakhstan there were 5 people in the cockpit, including the captain, first officer, flight engineer, the accident scene, navigator, and a radio operator. Found the altimeters of the Kazakhstan plane, but what they saw made the mystery even more confusing. This plane had a total of 4 altimeters displayed different numbers. The captain's barometric altimeter showed 16,000, while his electronic altimeter displayed 15,560 feet. The altimeter in front of the first officer showed 14,895, and the navigator's altimeter showed about 1,720 feet. This was highly likely to have been distorted due to the impact. If this unusual altimeter was ignored, also the other Kazakhstan plane was still above the 14,000 foot level, but from the position in the debris field, the investigators knew for sure that at the moment of impact, the Kazakhstan was lower than the Saudi plane, and that seemed to lead to only one conclusion: had exceeded the Saudi altitude of 14,000 feet. 2 weeks later, the black box data was sent back from London and Moscow, but instead of solving the mystery, they caused the investigation to veer in a completely different direction. Initially, all suspicions were directed at the Saudi crew, but the flight data from this plane told a completely different story. It showed the Saudi plane had climbed very steadily to exactly after confirming it would maintain flight level 14,000 feet. The pilots reduced engine thrust and stabilized the plane. At about 14,100 feet, the Saudi plane was almost exactly where air traffic control requested. Meanwhile, the data from the Kazakhstan plane was extremely strange. Its altitude graph was not a steady descent line, but looked stairs. The plane maintained altitude for a few seconds, then suddenly descended. Stabilized for a while, then suddenly descended further. The investigators had never seen this type of data before. So, what had actually happened? Inside the cockpit of this plane, the Kazakhstan plane was originally designed for the Soviet military. Had 5 members, with clearly divided tasks. However, having more people did not mean things would be more efficient. Among these 5 people, only the radio operator, spoke English well enough to communicate with air traffic control, including the other pilots directly flying the plane, only used Russian. That meant that every instruction from the control had to be heard by the radio operator in English, translated into Russian, and then relayed to the pilots. In other words, navigator. In the cockpit at that time, there was a game of telephone in Russian, where every command had to go through many intermediate steps before reaching the person flying the plane. But that was not the only barrier. Like most Soviet planes, Of that time, this Kazakhstan
entirely
plane was
according to
designed,
the metric system,
while Western planes used feet to measure altitude. This Kazakhstan plane used meters to be able to operate on international flight routes. To Trong 4th H Co G Cow has been improved to display in feet, however, the altimeter, right in front of the co-pilot, who was directly flying the plane at that time, still displayed in meters. Therefore, every altitude instruction from air traffic control had to continue to be converted from feet to meters before being passed to the co-pilot, in a cockpit crowded with people, full of such translation and conversion steps. Then indeed, confusion was almost inevitable. Now let's go back 4 minutes before the collision. The radio operator called Delhi Air Traffic Control and reported that they had reached an altitude of 15,000 feet, about 74 kilometers from Delhi. But black box data later proved that, in reality, the plane at that time was still at about 16,400 feet. So why did they report that? No one can know the reason for sure. The radio operator himself at that time did not have an altimeter right in front of him. To see the co-pilot's altimeter, he would have to lean over, which was very inconvenient. Perhaps he simply assumed the plane had descended to 15,000 feet and reported as such. It is also possible that he converted incorrectly meters to feet, or it is also possible that he was between confused. The two concepts of having reached and approaching the assigned altitude. Whatever the reason, the Delhi controller still trusted that report completely and continued to relay the next instruction: maintain flight level 15,000 feet. At the same time, he also informed them that ahead there was a Boeing 747 of Saudi flying in the opposite direction at an altitude of 14,000 feet, about 16 kilometers away from them, and expected to cross each other within 8 kilometers. All aircraft on the same frequency could hear each other's communications. That means the Kazakhstan crew also heard the entire exchange between Delhi and the Saudi Boeing earlier. They knew perfectly well that the other plane was in front of them. Yet inside the Kazakhstan cockpit, confusion still prevailed. The members continued to communicate with each other in Russian, trying to visualize the position of the Saudi plane in the sea of clouds. After a long silence, the radio operator asked air traffic control how far away the other plane was, and Delhi replied, 12 kilometers away at an altitude of 14,000 feet. At that very moment, the Kazakhstan plane finally passed the 15,000-foot mark, the exact assigned altitude. It should have stopped descending and held steady there, because the Saudi plane at this time was only about 900 feet below it and was very fast from the opposite direction. But that did not happen. The Kazakhstan plane continued to descend. 30 long seconds passed and no one spoke up. The altimeter needle continued to rotate downward. 14,800 feet, 14,600 feet, 14,400 feet. Outside the cockpit window, the sky was covered in clouds. The Kazakhstan plane plunged into a giant white cloud. From the opposite side, the Saudi Boeing 747 was also flying into that very same cloud, and the result everyone already knows. So in the end, who was to blame? In the weeks following the disaster, the Indian government established an investigation commission headed by Judge Lahoti. At this point, two important questions needed to be answered. That is why the Kazakhstan plane continued to descend. And why did the black box data form a graph like a staircase? The report concluded that although the radio operator had confirmed the order to maintain at 15,000 feet, the co-pilot, who was directly flying the plane, very likely misunderstood the phrase 14,000, which was only used to describe the altitude of the Saudi plane, as a new instruction requiring them to continue descending to 14,000 feet, according to the official conclusion. It was this tragic language misunderstanding that led to the disaster. As for the staircase-shaped altitude graph, investigators believed that it was likely due to a faulty sensor, and not because the plane was constantly changing altitude due to turbulence, so this hypothesis was ruled out. The consequences of the accident lasted for a long time. Afterward, Kazakhstan Airlines, which was already on the verge of bankruptcy, has now officially ceased operations. All assets were transferred to the newly established Air Kazakhstan, but this airline also went bankrupt in 2004 before being reorganized into Air Astana, the airline that is still operating to this day. After the collision, the Indian government revealed that there had previously been 10 serious near misses in the country's skies. Most were related to airlines. From former Soviet Union countries, many incidents were said to stem from the limited English proficiency of the pilots. Indian air traffic controllers also organized a strike, demanding the reconstruction of the licensing system, officially improving training quality, and opening more separate civil aviation corridors around Delhi to reduce the risk of collisions. India also petitioned the International Civil Aviation Organization and requested them to apply a minimum English proficiency standard of level 4 for pilots and air traffic controllers worldwide. This proposal was later accepted internationally. At the same time, India also became the second country in the world after the US to mandate that all aircraft operating in its airspace must be equipped with a TCAS system to automatically warn and avoid mid-air collisions. Perhaps the most heartbreaking thing always lies in what happened afterward. Many victims' bodies were never identified. Some people came from villages so poor that even their own relatives could not be located somewhere out there. There may still be families who never knew what happened to their loved ones. They do not know that their brother, sister, son, or daughter perished on flight Sadia 763 and flight Kazakhstan 1907. To them, their loved one simply left home to work and then never returned again.